Tonight, picture a city that is almost too quiet. It is the very end of summer, in the year 1666, and London is asleep, or something close to it, in the small hours before a Sunday morning. The night is warm. It has been a long, dry, thirsty summer. One of those summers that comes only rarely to England, when the rain forgets to fall for week after week, and the whole country goes slowly gold and then slowly brown, and the timber of 10,000 old houses dries out in its joints until it is light as kindling and thin as paper. The river is low. The wells are low. The wooden water pipes that run under the streets are half empty, and a steady dry wind is coming up out of the east, off the flatlands and the estuary, moving between the houses in a way that is not unpleasant, not yet, only warm and constant and patient, the kind of wind that turns a candle flame sideways and then lets it stand up straight again. The city it moves through is a city of wood. You should hold that thought gently, because everything that is about to happen for the next several nights depends upon it. London in 1666 is a city built almost entirely of oak and pitch and plaster and thatch, its houses leaning out over the lanes on their upper floors until the ones on either side of a narrow street very nearly touch at the top, so that a man in an attic on one side could almost reach across and shake hands with his neighbour opposite. The lanes themselves are narrow, crooked, medieval, laid down long before anyone dreamed of carts wider than a barrow, and they run down toward the river in a tangle, past the warehouses on the waterfront where the merchants keep their goods, and those goods, tonight, include tar and pitch and oil and tallow and hemp and brandy and coal and turpentine, all the fuel of a great trading port stacked and stored and waiting in the dark. On a small street called Pudding Lane, a little way back from the river, close to the northern end of London Bridge, there is a baker's shop. The baker's ovens have been raked out and banked down for the night, or the baker believes they have. The household is asleep above the shop, the wind moves along the lane, and somewhere in the warm brick belly of that oven, or in the wood pile stacked a little too close beside it, a single ember that should have died is very quietly, very patiently deciding not to. That is the whole of it. That is where a city begins to end, but do not let that trouble you tonight. You already know how this story turns out in the broad shape of it, because it is one of the most famous few days in the long life of London, and because the city, as you know perfectly well, is still there. It is still there tonight, larger and brighter than anyone in 1666 could have imagined. So there is nothing here to keep you awake. There is only a long, slow, extraordinary story to be told, from the very beginning, gently and completely, one quiet piece at a time, and you are not required to remember any of it. You are only invited to let it carry you down into sleep. So settle now. Settle into whatever stillness you have made for yourself tonight, the pillow found, the blanket at the right weight, the last small task of the day set down at last. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves. Let the lamp, if there is a lamp, grow dim. Let the day you have had, whatever kind of day it was, slip quietly down and away from you, one soft inch at a time, the way the tide goes out from a flat shore, without any fuss, without asking your permission, simply leaving. You do not have to follow the dates. You do not have to hold the names. If your attention drifts off in the middle of a sentence and does not come back, that is exactly right. That is the whole purpose, and the story will still be here, going quietly on, if you happen to surface again. Before we go on, if you find that you enjoy these long, slow journeys into history, the kind that are made to be slept through, then you might gently subscribe and leave a like on the video, but truly only if you enjoy what I do here, because there is no hurry about it and no obligation at all. And if you would like to, you might leave, down in the comments below, the place where you are listening from tonight and the hour of your own local time as your eyes begin to close. It is a small and lovely thing to do, and it helps other people who cannot sleep to find their way to this quiet corner, and it is a gentle pleasure, in the morning, to see the whole slow wave of the world going to bed together, one time zone after another, from a farmhouse in New Zealand to a flat in London to a porch in the American West. So, leave your light on the map if you wish. And now let us begin, and let us begin, as we always should, a long way before the beginning. Because before there was a great fire of London, there had to be a London, and a very particular kind of London. A London that had spent something like 600 years quietly and unknowingly building itself into the perfect thing to burn. And to understand how the fire could do what it did, in the few short days it was given, you have to understand that city first. The way you would have to understand a forest before you understood a forest fire. So let the flames wait, they are in no hurry. Let us walk instead through the London of the early autumn of 1666 while it is still whole, while every one of its 13,000 houses is still standing, and every one of its more than 100 churches still has its roof, and let us look at how it was made, and how it was crowded, and how, without meaning to, it had arranged itself into a trap. London had begun, as so many things in Britain had begun, with the Romans 16 centuries before, as a small walled trading town on the north bank of the Thames, at the first place upriver where the tidal river could conveniently be bridged. The Romans called it Londinium, and they gave it a wall, a great wall of ragstone and brick nearly 2 miles around, with gates in it, whose names still cling to the city long after the stones have gone. Ludgate and Newgate and Aldgate and Bishopsgate and the rest of them. When the Romans left, the town shrank and slept for a while, and then slowly woke again. And through all the centuries that followed, the Saxons and the Danes and the coming of the Normans and the building of the Tower, London kept to that same old shape, more or less a densely packed town inside the ghost of its Roman wall, with the river along its southern edge and one single bridge crossing to the marshy suburb of Southwark on the far side. It grew inward and upward rather than outward. Land inside the wall was precious, and so the houses were built tall and narrow, 3 and 4 and 5 stories, and to gain a little more space on each upper floor they were built with jetties, each story projecting out a foot or two beyond the one below, so that the buildings loomed over the streets and leaned toward one another as they rose. Timber was the material of nearly everything, oak frames filled in with wattle and daub, that ancient mixture of woven sticks and mud and dung and straw, the whole thing plastered over, and often coated with pitch to keep out the weather, and roofed in the poorer quarters with thatch, and everywhere pierced with wooden shutters and hung with wooden signs. It was a beautiful city in its way, and a filthy one, and above all it was a crowded one. By 1666 something like 400,000 people were living in and around London, packed into those old lanes and courts and alleys. More people than in any other city in the whole of Europe, save Paris, and most of them were living in the same square mile of medieval streets that the Romans had walled off long ago. The lanes were so narrow in places that 2 loaded carts could not pass, and the upper stories so close overhead that the daylight barely reached the ground. And into every spare corner had been crammed a workshop or a warehouse or a stable or a brewhouse or a bakehouse, each with its own fire, its own hearth, its own furnace, burning day and night. There were bakers and brewers and dyers and smiths and soap boilers and candle makers, all of them trades that needed heat, all of them keeping fires that were never quite out. And down along the river, where the wharves and the quays and the great merchant houses stood, the cellars and storehouses were packed to their beams with everything that a port at the centre of a growing empire brings home and holds. And much of it, as the wind would soon discover, was the sort of thing that does not merely burn, but leaps into flame with a kind of joy. Now, a city made of dried oak and pitch and thatch, packed as tight as this one was, had of course caught fire before. It caught fire constantly. A city like this had small fires the way a body has small aches, all the time, as a simple condition of being alive. A knocked-over candle, a spark from a forge, a chimney left too long uncleaned, an overheated oven, a drunk man with a pipe. A child with a rushlight, and a house would go up, and sometimes 2 or 3 houses with it, and the neighbours would come running, and the thing would be beaten out, and the parish would count its losses, and life would go on. London had burned in patches over and over across the centuries, and the people who lived there had grown so used to the idea of fire that they had stopped being properly afraid of it, which is a habit that tends to end badly. There had been great fires before, real ones, a terrible one back in the year 1135 that had done enormous damage and, some said, wrecked the old wooden London Bridge, and the memory of these things survived in the rules the city made for itself. Rules that said, quite sensibly, that houses ought to be built of stone, that party walls ought to be thick, that thatch ought to be forbidden. But the rules were old, and they were widely and cheerfully ignored, because stone was expensive and timber was cheap, and a man who wanted to add a room onto the front of his house at second-floor height was not going to be stopped by a statute from the reign of a king who was already 300 years dead. So the city stayed wooden, and stayed crowded, and trusted, as cities do, that the next fire would be like the last one, small and local and quickly beaten. And against fire the London of 1666 had almost nothing. This is the part that is hard to feel from where we sit now in a world of engines and hydrants and alarms. There was no fire brigade. There was no organisation of any kind whose job it was to put out fires. What there was instead was the parish, and the neighbours, and a scattering of simple tools kept in the churches, and a body of law that made fire fighting everybody's duty, and therefore, in the panic of a real emergency, nobody's. Each parish was supposed to keep, usually in the church, a set of leather buckets, and long poles with hooks on the end called fire hooks, great iron claws on chains that could be flung up to catch the beam of a burning house so that a team of men, or a team of horses, could haul the whole building down, and ladders and axes, and a few of the parishes had a fire engine, which sounds far grander than it was. A fire engine in 1666 was a wooden tub of water on wheels with a hand pump and a spout, worked by men heaving at a lever, throwing a thin jet of water perhaps as far as a strong man could throw a bucketful, and needing to be dragged through those narrow lanes by hand and constantly refilled from the river or the conduits, and forever breaking down. When a fire began, the method was not really to put water on it at all. Water was for small fires. For anything larger, the only method that worked, the only method there had ever been, was to make a gap. You pulled down the houses in the path of the fire, with the hooks and with gunpowder if you had to, faster than the fire could reach them, and you left it a strip of bare ground it could not cross, and you let it burn itself out against that gap. Everything depended on doing this early, and doing it decisively, and doing it before the fire was too hot to approach, and on somebody with the authority to order men to destroy the homes of their neighbours giving that order in time. And that, as we shall see, was exactly the thing that did not happen. But before the fire, there had been something else, something that hung over the London of that year like a shadow that had only just begun to lift, and that had left the city frightened and thinned and strange, because the year before the fire, the year 1665, had been the year of the Great Plague. The last and worst of the great outbreaks of bubonic plague that had visited England on and off ever since the Black Death 300 years before, had swept through London in the hot months of 1665 and killed, by the most careful modern reckoning, something close to 100,000 people, very nearly a quarter of everyone in the city, in a single dreadful year. Those who could leave had left, the court and the wealthy and anyone with somewhere in the country to go, and those who could not had stayed and endured it, watching the red crosses go up on the doors of the infected houses, with the desperate words "Lord have mercy upon us" painted above them, listening for the bell of the dead cart in the night, and the awful flat cry of the men who pushed it. Bring out your dead. Whole streets had emptied, grass had grown in the lanes, and then, through the winter, the plague had at last begun to loosen its grip, and through the spring and summer of 1666 the people had trickled back, the shops had reopened, the court had returned, and London had begun, cautiously, to breathe again and to believe that the worst thing that could ever happen to it had already happened and was over. It is worth pausing on that, gently, because it tells you something about the mood of the city in the late summer of 1666. This was a place that had just come through hell, and knew it, and was tired, and wanted very much to believe that its share of catastrophe was spent. It was also, on top of everything else, a city at war. England in 1666 was in the middle of the Second Anglo-Dutch War, a long and bad-tempered naval war with the Dutch Republic over trade and colonies and pride, and the war was not going especially well, and the war had made the ordinary people of London jumpy and suspicious in a way that would matter enormously once the fire began. Because a frightened crowd looking for someone to blame is a dangerous thing, and this crowd already had its enemies chosen. The Dutch were the enemy, and behind the Dutch, in the popular imagination, were the French, who were shortly expected to join the war, and behind both of them, always, in the mind of a Protestant London that had lived through civil war and revolution, and the execution of one king, and the restoration of his son, were the Catholics, the great imagined conspiracy of papists forever plotting to burn the Protestant city down. None of these people had anything whatever to do with the fire that was coming, but when the fire came, the crowd would already know, with the terrible certainty of the frightened, exactly whose fault it must be. And over all of it lay the summer, that long, dry, remarkable summer which had been baking the city since the spring. It had scarcely rained for months. The diarist John Evelyn, one of the two great eyewitnesses whose careful private writing lets us stand so close to these events, would call it a fiery drought. The timber of the houses was as dry as it had ever been in living memory. The stored goods along the river were dry, the pitch on the walls was soft and tacky in the heat. And through the last days of August the wind had settled into the east and grown strong, a hot, dry, steady, insistent easterly, the worst possible wind, a wind that would take anything that started at the eastern end of the city and drive it, hour after hour after hour, straight into the crowded heart of everything. Everything was ready. The city did not know it, but everything was ready, laid out as neatly as if some careful and patient hand had spent 600 years arranging it. The dry wood and the packed lanes and the leaning houses, and the pitch and the oil and the brandy in the cellars, and the strong east wind, and the tired, frightened, war-jumpy people who had stopped being afraid of fire. And all of it now waited. In the warm dark, on the last night of an ordinary week, for a single ember in a baker's oven on a small street called Pudding Lane to make up its mind. And so we come, at last and quietly, to the baker. His name was Thomas Fariner, though it is spelled a dozen different ways in the old records, Fariner and Fariner and Fariner and more, because spelling in the 1600s was a loose and cheerful business, and he was a baker, and not just any baker but a baker to the king, which meant he held a contract to supply ship's biscuit, the hard, dry, twice-baked bread that fed the navy, to the fleet that was at that moment fighting the Dutch. This is a small detail, but it is a lovely one, because it means that the fire that would nearly destroy London began in an oven that was, in its humble way, part of the war effort, baking hard bread for the sailors. Fariner's house and shop stood on Pudding Lane, a short, steep, narrow street that ran down toward Thames Street and the river, in a crowded parish close to the northern foot of London Bridge. It was a typical house of its kind, timber-framed, several stories tall, with the bakehouse and its great oven on the ground floor, and the family and servants living in the rooms above. And it was pressed hard against its neighbours on either side, and its upper floors leaned out over the lane. On the night of Saturday the 1st of September, 1666, going into the small hours of Sunday the 2nd, Thomas Fariner did what he did every night. He finished his baking, and he raked out and banked down the fire in his oven, damping it down so that it would smoulder low and safe until the morning, or so he would swear, afterward, again and again, to anyone who would listen, that he had done. And then he and his household went up to bed. His daughter Hannah, his manservant, and a maidservant whose name we do not certainly know. And the house settled into the dark, and the wind moved along Pudding Lane. And for an hour or two nothing at all happened. And then, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, something in the bakehouse, or in the fuel stacked near the oven, or in a stray drift of embers the raking had missed, quietly came to life. We will never know the exact spark. Farriner insisted to his death that his oven had been properly out, that no fire could have come from it, and perhaps he was right, and it began in a heap of kindling or a smouldering beam or a fault in the chimney, and perhaps he was simply a frightened man who did not wish to be remembered as the one who burned down London, which is an entirely human thing to wish. It does not really matter now. What matters is that by the small hours of that Sunday morning, the ground floor of the bakehouse on Pudding Lane was filling with smoke, and the smoke rose up through the timber house toward the sleeping family above. It was the smoke that woke them, not the flames. Farriner woke to a house full of choking smoke and the crackle of fire below, and he roused his household. And they found the stairs already impassable, the fire between them and the street door, and so they did the only thing left to do. They climbed. Out of an upstairs window they went and up along the guttering and across the rooftops, from Farriner's house to the house next door, scrambling in their nightclothes over the tiles in the dark, with the fire glowing beneath them, and so they came down, shaken and sooty and alive, into the lane a little way along, all of them but one. The maidservant did not climb. Whether she was too frightened to go out onto the roof, whether she froze at the window and could not make herself follow, whether the smoke reached her first, we do not know, but she stayed in the burning house, and she died there. And she has the sad distinction of being the first person to die in the Great Fire of London, an unnamed young woman, terrified of the height, on the very first night, before anyone yet understood that this was anything more than one more house going up on one more night, in a city where houses were always going up. The neighbours were awake now. Someone was ringing the bells of the little church of St. Margaret nearby, a backward jangling peal that meant fire, and men were coming out into the lane with buckets, and the parish constables were arriving, and for a little while it looked like what it had so often been before, a bad house fire, dangerous, frightening. But the sort of thing London knew how to handle. But the wind was in the east, and Pudding Lane ran down toward the river, and the fire spreading from Farriner's house to the houses on either side, and then leaning out with the wind toward the houses across the lane, was already reaching, greedily, toward the bottom of the hill, toward Thames Street, toward the warehouses on the waterfront where the pitch and the oil and the coal and the hay. And the brandy was stored, and once it reached those, everything would change. The constables who gathered in Pudding Lane in the small hours could see the danger. There was an old and well-understood remedy, and they proposed it at once. Pull down the houses around the fire, make the gap, deny it the fuel. But there was a difficulty, and the difficulty was the law and the ownership of property, because you could not simply tear down a man's house on your own authority in the middle of the night, and the man whose authority was needed, the man who alone could give the order to begin the destruction that might yet save the city, was the Lord Mayor of London, and so, in the dark hours of that Sunday morning, they sent for him. The Lord Mayor of London that year was a man named Sir Thomas Bloodworth, and history has not been kind to him, and it is difficult, reading what he did and said that night, to argue that it should have been. Bloodworth was a merchant, a vintner, a man who had risen to the highest civic office in the kingdom, and he was roused from his bed and brought through the dark streets to Pudding Lane to look at the fire and to decide, and he arrived, and he looked, and he was not impressed. It was, to be fair to him, a moment when the fire did not yet look like the end of the world. It was still, at that hour, a fire among a cluster of houses, terrible for those houses, but of a kind the city saw often, and Bloodworth, tired and irritable and perhaps a little contemptuous of being dragged out of bed, looked at the flames and refused to give the order to pull down the houses, on the grounds that the owners could not be found in the night to consent, and that the city would be liable for the cost of rebuilding what it destroyed. And then he made the remark that has followed his name down through 3.5 centuries and will follow it as long as the story is told. Pish, he is supposed to have said, or something very like it. A woman might piss it out. And with that, having decided that the fire was beneath his concern, the Lord Mayor of London went back to bed. It is one of the great fatal sentences of English history, casual and dismissive and catastrophically wrong, and it was spoken in the one narrow window of time when a firm decision might still have contained the thing, when a gap pulled across the top of Pudding Lane might still have starved the fire before it reached the river. That window closed while Bloodworth slept. By the time he was roused again, only a few hours later, and came back to look, the fire had reached Thames Street, and the warehouses had caught, and the thin flames of a house fire had become a wall of flame roaring up out of the pitch and the oil and the tallow with a heat that no man could stand near, and it was far, far too late for hooks and buckets, and it had begun to be too late. Though no one yet quite dared to say it, for London itself. Let us stay a moment with that Sunday morning, the 2nd of September, because it is the morning on which an ordinary fire became the great fire, and because we have, to help us see it, the eyes of one of the most delightful men who ever kept a diary. His name was Samuel Pepys, and he was a naval administrator, a clever, ambitious, curious, endlessly human official of the Navy Board, and he lived in the city not far from the fire, and he wrote down every night, in a private shorthand, exactly what he had seen and done and felt, without the smallest suspicion that anyone would ever read it, and because of that his account of these days is one of the treasures of the language, gossipy and honest and frightened and greedy and brave all at once. Pepys was woken that Sunday morning, before dawn, by one of his maids, a girl called Jane, who had seen the glow of the fire from a window and thought he would want to know. He got up, and he went to the window in his nightgown, and he looked out, and he saw the fire away to the east, and he judged it, as everyone did at first, to be far off and no great matter, a fire like other fires, and being a sensible man who liked his sleep, he went back to bed. It is a wonderfully human moment, the great chronicler of the fire deciding, on the first morning, that the fire was not worth getting up for. But when he rose again later in the morning, the fire had not gone out. It had grown. From a higher window he could see now that a great many houses were alight, down toward the bridge, and that the fire was spreading, and word was coming up from the servants and the neighbours of streets already gone. And so Pepys did what a curious man does. He went to see for himself. He walked toward the fire, and then, to get a better view, he went to the Tower of London, which stood a little to the east of the flames, and climbed up onto a high place there, and looked out over the burning city, and what he saw frightened him properly at last. He saw the fire raging along the waterfront, the warehouses gone, the wharves ablaze, and he saw the people. He saw, and he wrote it down that very night in his particular vivid way, the poor people staying in their houses as long as till the very fire touched them, and then running into boats or clambering from one set of stairs by the waterside to another. He saw them trying to save what they could, loading their goods into boats and carts, throwing furniture into the river, and he saw, in a detail so strange and so tender that it has never left the story since, the pigeons. The pigeons of the burning houses, he wrote, were loth to leave their homes, and hovered about the windows and balconies till they burned their wings and fell down. That image, the birds circling their own burning houses until they could not fly, refusing to abandon the only home they knew, is somehow the truest thing anyone recorded about that day, because it was exactly what the people were doing too, staying too long, holding on too hard, unable to believe until the very last moment that the thing they had built their lives around was truly about to be taken from them. Pepys had seen enough. He understood, standing on that high place at the tower, something that the Lord Mayor had not understood in the night, which was that this fire was not going to be stopped by anyone below the very top, and so, being a man who knew how the government worked and knew people at court, he did a remarkable and useful thing. He took a boat, and he had himself rowed upriver, through the smoke and the floating ash, and the panic on the water, all the way to Whitehall, to the palace of the king, and he demanded to be brought before Charles II himself, and he told the king plainly what he had seen, and he told him the one thing that mattered, which was that unless His Majesty commanded houses to be pulled down, and pulled down fast and in great numbers, nothing could stop the fire. The king, to his very great credit, understood at once. Charles II, whatever his many faults, was not a stupid man, and was not, in a crisis, a cowardly one, and he grasped immediately what Pepys was telling him, and he gave the order there and then, pull down houses, spare nothing, make the gaps, and he sent Pepys straight back to carry the command to the Lord Mayor, and he set his own brother, James, the Duke of York, to the work of fighting the fire, and in the days that followed the king and the duke would ride into the burning streets themselves, on horseback, among the smoke and the sparks, directing the men, passing buckets with their own hands, standing knee-deep in the muck and the water, in a way that the ordinary people of London would remember for the rest of their lives, because it was one thing to be a distant merry monarch in a palace, and quite another to see the king himself, black with soot, wading in the gutter to fight the flames for your street. Pepys took the king's order back down river and found the Lord Mayor at last in the streets near the fire. And here we have another of those small, unforgettable moments, because Bloodworth, who only hours before had said a woman might piss the fire out, was now a broken man, wandering the smoke like a person in a dream, undone by the size of the thing he had failed to stop. Pepys gave him the king's command to pull down houses, and Bloodworth cried out, in a kind of despairing wail that Pepys wrote down word for word, "Lord, what can I do? I am spent. People will not obey me. I have been pulling down houses, but the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it." And it was true. That was the horror of that Sunday afternoon and the days that followed. The fire had grown so large and so hot that the old method no longer worked, because to pull down a house you had to get men close enough to fix the hooks and haul, and the fire was now throwing out such heat, and the wind was carrying burning fragments so far ahead of the main blaze, that by the time a gap was made, the fire had already jumped across it, sailing over the bare ground on the wind in a storm of sparks, and lighting the houses on the far side, so that the men pulling down houses found themselves working in a furnace, and gaining nothing, and forever falling back. The fire had achieved a size at which it made its own weather, drawing in air from all around to feed itself, a hot roaring updraught that lifted burning brands high into the sky and flung them hundreds of yards downwind, starting new fires far ahead of the old, so that the thing did not so much spread as leap, settling on roof after roof across the doomed city. And the wind never dropped. Never once through that whole long Sunday did the wind drop, but held steady out of the east, driving the fire on and on into the richest and most crowded heart of London. And what of the people, the 400,000 people whose city was burning under them? Through that Sunday and the nights that followed, the whole population of London was in motion, a slow, desperate river of frightened human beings and everything they owned, flowing outward and away from the fire, and the sight of it filled the diaries of everyone who watched. The streets were choked with people carrying their goods on their backs, wheeling them in barrows, piling them onto carts, and here the ordinary meanness and the ordinary kindness of people showed themselves side by side, because the men who owned carts, the carters and the country waggoners, quickly understood that they had become the most valuable men in England, and the price of a cart to carry your goods out of the fire rose and rose through those days from a few shillings to £5 to 10 to 30 to sums that in an ordinary week would have bought the cart itself and the horse with it, and there was nothing anyone could do but pay, if they could pay at all, and those who could not pay watched their neighbours drive away and turned back to save what they could carry in their arms. People carried the strangest things, the things that panic chooses, a birdcage, a portrait, a feather bed, a virginals, that small keyboard instrument, and Pepys noted seeing the River Thames itself covered with boats and lighters full of goods, and one thing above all floating on the water, and it was, he wrote, virginals, those little pianos, that in 1 out of 3 boats there was a pair of virginals in it, as though half the households of London had reached, in their terror, for the family instrument first. They fled to the open ground beyond the walls, north to the fields of Moorfields and Finsbury and Islington, and east and west into the country, and they camped there in their tens of thousands, whole families under the open sky with their furniture stacked around them, watching the glow of their burning city colour the underside of the smoke all night long. And Pepys himself, that clever, anxious human man, gives us the most honest picture of all of what it is to save your own things while the world ends, because on the Sunday and Monday nights, as the fire crept closer to his own house, he set about moving and hiding his most precious possessions with a frantic, practical, entirely relatable care. He sent his gold and his most important papers away by boat in the night. He had a pit dug in his garden, and into it, with the help of a friend, he buried his wine, and in the single most famous act of self-preservation of the entire fire, he buried his Parmesan cheese. A whole great wheel of Parmesan, expensive and beloved, lowered tenderly into a hole in the garden to save it from the flames. While London burned around him, and the fact that he wrote it down, "Without embarrassment, my Parmesan cheese as well as my wine and some other things," is exactly why we love him. Because it is so precisely what a real frightened person does, saving the cheese, and it makes those days human in a way that no grand account of the destruction ever could. Monday, the 3rd of September, was the day the fire ate the money. Through Sunday night it had spread relentlessly westward and northward, up from the river into the heart of the city, and on Monday it reached the very centre of London's wealth and pride, the great commercial district around Cornhill and Lombard Street, and the Royal Exchange. The Royal Exchange was the beating heart of English trade, a magnificent building. The place where the merchants of London met to do the business of the world, a grand courtyard ringed with arcades and shops, and lined with statues of the kings and queens of England. The fire took it in a matter of hours. It came up the surrounding streets, and it caught the timbers of the Exchange, and it burned through the shops and the arcades and swept around the great courtyard. And one by one, as the eyewitnesses recorded with a kind of awe, the royal statues fell, the stone kings toppling from their niches into the fire. All of them, it was said, save one, the statue of Sir Thomas Gresham, the merchant who had built the place 100 years before, which was found afterwards standing alone and unharmed amid the ruin. A detail people repeated to one another for years, because it seemed to mean something, though no one could quite say what. With the Exchange went the neighbouring streets, the goldsmiths of Lombard Street, who were the bankers of their day, the merchants' great houses, the halls of the livery companies, all the accumulated wealth and record of the city's commerce, and the fire. Growing hotter and vaster with every hour, roared on. And it was on this Monday, as the losses mounted past all bearing, and the people's terror curdled into rage, that the darker human thing began. Because a catastrophe this total could not, people felt, simply have happened. A city did not just burn. Someone had done this. Someone had set it. And England was at war, and the enemy was known, and so through the crowds of the fleeing and the homeless there ran, faster than the fire itself, a rumour. And the rumour was that the fire had been set deliberately by the enemies of England, by the Dutch, by the French, by the Catholics, that foreign agents were even now moving through the streets throwing fireballs into houses to spread thee. Blaze and the frightened crowds, needing someone to punish, went looking for foreigners. It became, for a few ugly days, dangerous to be a stranger in London, dangerous to have an accent, dangerous to be seen doing anything that a terrified mind could twist into arson. A Frenchman carrying tennis balls was set upon by a mob who swore the balls were fireballs. A Dutch baker was nearly killed. Foreigners were dragged from their houses and beaten in the streets, their property destroyed, some very nearly lynched, and the trained bands and the gentlemen and the king's own men found that a good part of their work in those days was not fighting the fire at all, but protecting terrified innocent foreigners from their own neighbours, pulling them out of the hands of the crowd, locking them up in prison for their own safety. It is one of the oldest and saddest patterns in the whole of human history, the frightened crowd inventing an enemy, and the great fire showed it in a single vivid week, and it would have its final cruel act later, when the fire was long out and the city needed, more than anything, someone to blame. Tuesday, the 4th of September, was the worst day of the Great Fire of London, the day the flames reached their greatest fury and swallowed the greatest prizes, and it was the day of St. Paul's. To understand what the loss of St. Paul's meant, you have to set aside, for a moment, the great domed cathedral that stands on that hill today, the one Sir Christopher Wren would build afterward out of the ashes, because that cathedral did not yet exist, and picture instead the one that did, Old St. Paul's, the medieval cathedral which had stood on the highest ground in the city, at the very summit of the hill on which London is built, for something like 500 years. It was one of the largest churches in all of Europe, a vast, ancient, weathered pile of stone, longer than the cathedral that replaced it, with a nave so wide and famous that Londoners simply called it Paul's Walk and used it as a public thoroughfare and a meeting place and a market, a place to hear the news and hire a servant and meet a friend, the noisy, beating social heart of the old city under its holy roof. Its spire had been the tallest in Christendom until lightning took it 100 years before, and even without the spire it towered over everything, the great grey landmark visible for miles, the thing that meant London. And on that Tuesday the people of London believed, right up until the last hours, that St. Paul's would be their salvation, because St. Paul's was made of stone, and stone does not burn, and the cathedral stood in a wide churchyard, a broad open space of gravestones and ground that they thought the fire could not cross, and so, as the flames came up the hill toward it, the booksellers and stationers of the district, whose trade clustered around the cathedral, did the thing that seemed most sensible in all the world. They carried their stock into St. Paul's for safekeeping. They brought their books, thousands upon thousands of them, whole warehouses of printed sheets and bound volumes, the entire stock of the London book trade, and they packed them into the crypt of the cathedral, the great vaulted stone undercroft called St. Faith's beneath the choir, and they shut the heavy doors. And they trusted 500 years of stone to keep the fire out. But St. Paul's, that Tuesday, was not quite the fortress it appeared. It was old, and it had been neglected through the troubled years of civil war, when soldiers had stabled their horses in it and stripped it of what they could, and it was, at that very moment, wrapped from top to bottom in a cage of wooden scaffolding, because a young architect named Christopher Wren, of whom we will hear a great deal more, had recently been engaged to survey and begin the repair of the crumbling old building, and the scaffolding stood ready against its walls. And the roof, the great roof, though it was covered on the outside with sheets of lead, was carried underneath on a vast frame of ancient dry oak timbers. 5 centuries seasoned, as dry and as ready to burn as anything in London. The fire came up the hill in the evening, driven by that unrelenting east wind, and it caught the wooden scaffolding first, and ran up it like a ladder, and reached the roof, and found the old oak beneath the lead, and the greatest church in England began to burn from the top down. John Evelyn, watching, described what happened next, and it is one of the most terrible and unforgettable sights in the whole history of the city, because the lead of the roof, the acres of heavy grey lead that had kept the rain off for 500 years, grew hot in the burning and began to melt, and it ran. The molten lead poured down off the roof and streamed down the walls and out through the gutters and ran, Evelyn wrote, down the streets in a stream, so that the very pavements glowed with a fiery redness, and no horse nor man was able to tread on them. A river of liquid metal running downhill from the burning cathedral into the streets of the city. And then the stones themselves began to fail, because stone, though it does not burn, does not love such heat, and the great stones of the cathedral, superheated, began to crack and to burst, flying apart with reports like cannon fire, splitting and shattering and raining down. And the huge structure groaned and began to come apart, and at last the roof fell in, the whole vast weight of it crashing down through the burning church, and down terribly through the floor of the choir, and into the crypt below, into St. Faith's, where the entire stock of the London book trade lay so carefully stored, and it set the books alight, and they burned. It is said the books in the crypt of St. Paul's burned for a week, that the paper smouldered on in that stone oven long after the flames above had died, and the booksellers, who had done the one careful, sensible, prudent thing, who had trusted stone to save what mattered to them, were ruined utterly, their whole trade turned to ash beneath the fallen roof of the cathedral they had trusted. Old St. Paul's, 500 years old, the landmark and meeting place and pride of the city, the thing that meant London, was gone in a single night, a roofless, gutted, melting ruin on the hill, glowing against the smoke. And when the people of London saw that even St. Paul's had fallen, something went out of them, some last belief that there was a limit to what the fire could take. And it seemed, that Tuesday night, with the cathedral burning on the hilltop and the whole city a sea of flame, from the tower in the east to the temple in the west, as though London were simply going to burn until there was nothing left of it at all, as though the fire would not stop until it had eaten the entire city down to the bare and blackened ground. But the fire did stop, and it is worth understanding how, because it did not simply run out of city to burn, and it was not, in the end, put out by water, for no amount of water was ever going to be thrown by hand at a fire this size. Two things stopped the Great Fire of London, and one of them was gunpowder, and the other was the wind, and of the two, the wind was the greater. Though the men with the gunpowder did not know that, and fought on as though everything depended on them, which, for all they knew, it did. Through Tuesday and into Wednesday, as the old method of pulling houses down by hand proved hopelessly too slow, a new and more drastic method took its place, and it came, in part, from the men of the Navy, who understood gunpowder and demolition, and it was championed by the Duke of York and by the King. Instead of hauling houses down beam by beam, they would blow them up. They would pack a house in the fire's path with barrels of gunpowder and blow it flat in an instant, and blow the houses beside it flat, and so tear open, all at once, a firebreak far wider and faster than any team of men with hooks could ever have pulled. A broad belt of rubble and open ground that the fire, however hot, could not leap. There was great resistance to this at first, because Londoners loved their houses and could not bear to see them destroyed while they still stood whole and untouched, and the noise of the explosions terrified people who thought the enemy's guns had come, and there was a real danger, well understood, that blowing up houses might scatter burning debris and start new fires rather than stop old ones. But as Tuesday wore into Wednesday and the fire showed no sign of stopping on its own, the objections fell away before necessity, and the demolition men set to work in earnest, ringing the fire with charges, blowing broad gaps across its path, and above all working to save the two things that absolutely could not be allowed to fall. To the west lay the great houses of the nobility along the Strand, and Whitehall, the palace of the king himself, and the fire was driving that way, and to the east, downwind at the fire's back but perilously close, stood the Tower of London, the ancient fortress, the arsenal of the kingdom, and inside the tower in its magazines lay a very great store of gunpowder, hundreds of barrels of it, enough if the fire ever reached it, to blow the tower and a good part of the eastern city into the sky in a single blast that would have made everything before it seemed small. The garrison of the tower did not wait for permission or for hooks or for the Lord Mayor. They took the matter into their own hands, and using the tower's own gunpowder while they still safely could, they blew up the houses all around the fortress, flattening a wide ring of buildings, clearing a broad belt of open ground between themselves and the advancing flames, and in doing so they saved the tower, and its magazines, and quite possibly the eastern half of London from an explosion that does not bear thinking about. And through all these days, in the middle of all of it, rode the king. Charles II and his brother James, the Duke of York, did not watch the fire from the safety of Whitehall. They came down into the burning streets day after day on horseback, and they took command of the fighting where the civic authorities had collapsed, setting up posts of soldiers and gentlemen at intervals round the fire, organising the demolitions, keeping order, and the two royal brothers were seen everywhere in the thick of it, the king himself, it was said. dismounting to stand among the ordinary men and pass buckets and handle the fire tools with his own hands, his fine clothes soaked and filthy, his face black with smoke, handing out gold coins from his own purse to encourage the exhausted workers to stay at their posts. Whatever else can be said of Charles II, and much can be said, in that 1 week he behaved exactly as a king in a catastrophe ought to behave, and the people of London, who had lost almost everything, did not forget it, and it did more for the affection between the restored monarchy and its capital than any number of proclamations could have done. But the truth, which the king and the duke and the powder men could not know as they laboured, was that the fire's real master was not any of them. It was the wind. All through Sunday and Monday and Tuesday, the wind had blown strong and steady out of the east, and it was the wind, far more than the fuel, that had driven the fire on, hurling burning brands ahead of the flames, fanning the blaze white hot, defeating every firebreak by simply carrying the fire over it through the air. And on Tuesday night, into Wednesday, the wind at last began to drop. It slackened, and it eased, and by Wednesday it had fallen to almost nothing, and the moment the wind died, everything changed. Without the wind to leap it forward, the fire could no longer jump the gaps, and now the firebreaks held, the broad belts of rubble blown open by the gunpowder finally did their work, and the fire, deprived of its wind and starved at its edges of new fuel, began, for the first time in 4 days, to falter, to sink, to burn down rather than out, to die at last against the gaps the men had torn across its path. By Wednesday evening the great fire of London was, in the main, halted, checked all around its edges, no longer spreading, though it would smoulder and flare in the ruins for days and weeks to come, and though the ground would stay too hot to walk on in places for a long time, and the cellars would glow with buried fire, and the fallen coal and the deep stores would burn on underground where no one could reach them. But the spreading was over, the city that was left had stopped shrinking, and the people came out, in the strange grey silence of Thursday morning, into the smoking ruin of what had been the greatest city in Europe, to see in the daylight what remained. What remained was almost nothing. Within the old Roman walls where the crowded medieval city had stood, something like 4/5 of everything was gone. Simply gone, an unbroken desolation of ash and rubble and standing chimney stacks and the blackened stumps of walls, stretching from the tower in the east almost to the western edge of the walls and beyond them out to the temple. When the surveyors came, afterward, to count what had been lost, the numbers they produced were so large that they are difficult, even now, to hold in the mind. About 13,200 houses had been destroyed. 87 parish churches were gone, burned out, roofless, in addition to the great cathedral of St. Paul's itself. The Royal Exchange was gone, and the Custom House and the Guildhall, the ancient centre of the city's government, was a gutted shell, and 44 of the halls of the livery companies, those proud guilds of the trades, were destroyed, and the prisons, and the city gates, and 3 of the gates in the old wall. Something like 430 acres of the city, the overwhelming majority of everything inside the walls, had burned. The homes of perhaps 70,000 people, out of a city of maybe 400,000, had been wiped from the earth in 4 days. It was, in proportion to the city it struck, one of the greatest urban disasters in the whole of European history, a blow that fell on London with a completeness that is hard to compare to anything else, as though a hand had passed over the map and simply erased the old town. And yet, and this is the strange and much argued heart of the matter, almost nobody, as far as anyone could tell, had died. The official death toll of the Great Fire of London, the number that comes down to us in the old records, is astonishingly, almost unbelievably small, fewer than 10 people, a mere handful of named dead, of whom the poor terrified maidservant in Pudding Lane on the first night was the first. For centuries this tiny figure was simply accepted, and it became part of the legend of the fire, the great miracle of it, that a disaster which destroyed the homes of tens of thousands had killed almost no one. Because the fire, for all its terrible speed, had moved slowly enough on foot that people could always stay ahead of it, could always gather their goods and their children and walk away in front of the flames, and so the fire took the city but spared the people. But historians in more recent times have grown less sure of that comforting number, and have pointed out the things it may hide, that the deaths of the poor and the nameless were often simply never recorded at all, that the parish clerks who kept the counts were themselves burned out and scattered, that a fire which melted the lead of a cathedral roof and made stone explode was a fire hot enough to consume a human body so completely that nothing would be found of it, no bone, no trace, nothing to count, and that among the old and the sick and the very poor, the ones who could not move fast or had no one to carry them, there may well have been many more deaths than the official handful. Deaths that left no mark on any register because everything that might have recorded them had itself gone into the fire. We will never know the true number. It is one of the quiet, unanswerable questions the fire left behind. But whatever the true toll of the dead, the toll of the living was plain enough, and it was written across the fields north and east of the city, where the homeless had fled. Tens of thousands of Londoners, perhaps 100,000 and more, were now camped in the open country beyond the walls, at Moorfields and Finsbury and Islington, and out toward Highgate, a vast, sudden, involuntary city of refugees living under carts and scraps of canvas, and in hastily thrown-up huts and tents, surrounded by whatever furniture and goods they had managed to save, merchants and craftsmen and labourers all levelled together into the same wretched. Equality of loss. The well-to-do family who had saved their silver camped beside the labourer who had saved nothing, all of them staring back at the pall of smoke that still hung over the place where their homes had been. John Evelyn walked out among them and was moved almost beyond words by what he saw, the misery of it. Whole families who had lately been living in good houses now lying on the bare ground with the sky for a roof, and he wrote of the sight of it with a compassion that reaches across the centuries. The poor creatures lying by their scraps of furniture in the fields, reduced in a single week from comfort to nothing. And the king, who had ridden through the fire, now turned his attention to the fields, and here again Charles II did well, because he understood that 100,000 ruined, frightened, homeless people camped together in bitterness were not only a tragedy, but a danger. The very stuff of riot and revolution, and so he acted quickly to feed them and to calm them. He issued proclamations ordering that the surrounding towns and counties receive the refugees and let them trade, that food be brought into the fields, that the markets be kept supplied, and crucially, he rode out to the camps himself and spoke to the people directly, and told them, standing among them, that the fire had been an accident, a visitation of God and an act of nature, and not, whatever they had heard, the work of any foreign or Catholic plot, and he begged them not to take their grief and their rage out upon the innocent. It did not entirely work, because fear is not so easily reasoned with, but it helped, and slowly through that autumn the great refugee city in the fields thinned and dispersed, as people found lodgings with relatives or in the unburned suburbs, or drifted away to other towns, and the immediate emergency of 100,000 people sleeping in the open gave way to the slower, longer, harder question that now faced them all, the question that would occupy London for the next 50 years, which was simply this. What now? The old city was gone. What was to be built in its place, and how, and by whom, and would it be, when it rose, the same crowded wooden death trap as before, or something new? But before we follow the city up out of its ashes, there is one last dark chapter of the fire itself to be told, and it is the saddest of them all, because it happened when the flames were already out, in cold blood, in a courtroom, and it is the story of the man who was hanged for the Great Fire of London, who almost certainly did not do it. His name was Robert Hubert, and he was a young Frenchman, a watchmaker's son from Rouen, and by every account that survives he was a poor, damaged, simple soul, a man who was not entirely right in his mind, physically frail, perhaps lame, the kind of confused and friendless stranger that a frightened society reaches for when it needs a body to blame. In the weeks after the fire, with the city in ruins and the rumours of a Catholic plot still boiling through the people. The authorities were under enormous pressure to find the guilty hand, because it was almost unbearable, to the mind of the age, that a catastrophe so total could have no author, no villain, no one to punish, that it could simply have been an oven and a wind and 400 years of bad luck. And into this need walked Robert Hubert, who was arrested, and who then did the strangest and most fatal thing. He confessed. He confessed that he had started the Great Fire of London, that he had done it deliberately, that he was an agent of the French, that he had thrown a fireball through the window of the bakehouse in Pudding Lane and set the whole city alight. He confessed it eagerly, insistently, again and again, and he would not be talked out of it. The trouble was that almost everything he said was demonstrably false. He gave details that did not match the facts. He said he had acted with a gang of conspirators, then could not name them coherently. He claimed at first to have started the fire in a place where the fire had not begun, and only later, when it was pointed out to him, changed his story to fit Pudding Lane. He described throwing a fireball through a window of Farriner's bakehouse that, it was later realised, had no such window. Those who examined him could see, many of them, that the man was deranged, that his confession was a fantasy, that he could not possibly have done what he so desperately insisted he had done, and some of them said so plainly. There was even evidence, which emerged afterward, that Robert Hubert had not so much as been in England when the fire began, that he had arrived on a ship from Sweden 2 days after the fire started, that he could not have thrown any fireball into any bakehouse on that first night, because he was still at sea. And yet he was tried, and he was convicted on the strength of his own insane insistence upon his guilt, because he wanted so badly to be guilty, and because London wanted so badly for someone to be. And the machinery of the law, once set in motion by a confession, ground on to its conclusion regardless of the truth. Robert Hubert was found guilty of starting the Great Fire of London, and he was sentenced to death, and on a day in late October 1666 he was taken to the gallows at Tyburn and hanged by the neck until he was dead, put to death for a crime that the fire had not been, and that he had not committed, a confused foreign stranger executed to satisfy a city's need to believe that its suffering had a human cause and a human remedy. Even the man who ran the trial, it was said, did not truly believe him guilty. Thomas Farriner the baker, whose oven had in all likelihood been the real beginning, sat on the jury that condemned him, and had every reason of his own to want another man blamed. And so the one death that we can name with certainty as a direct killing of the Great Fire, apart from the poor and the nameless taken by the flames, was not caused by the fire at all, but by the fear that came after it, a judicial killing of an innocent madman. And it stands there in the record as a permanent quiet warning about what frightened people will do when they need a story with a villain in it. Years later, the official inquiries into the causes of the fire would conclude, soberly and correctly, what had been obvious all along to anyone willing to look, that the Great Fire of London had been begun by no plot and no enemy and no agent of any foreign power, but by the hand of God, as they put it in the language of the day, which is to say by accident, by a spark in a baker's shop on a windy night in a city made of tinder, and by nothing and no one more sinister than that. The Catholics did not do it. The Dutch did not do it. The French did not do it. Poor Robert Hubert did not do it. It was an oven, and a woodpile, and a drought, and an east wind, and 6 centuries of building a great city out of dry oak and pitch, and packing it too tight, and letting the old fire laws slide. And when at last the inscription came to be carved, decades later, upon the great monument that was raised near the spot where the fire began, it would at first, in the bitter religious politics of a later reign, blame the papists after all, and only much later would that lie be chiselled away, leaving the plain truth to stand at last, that the fire had been a dreadful accident and nothing more, and that the man hanged for it had been as innocent as the stones. And so we come to the rebuilding, which is in many ways the most remarkable part of the whole story, because it is the part where catastrophe turns slowly and with enormous difficulty, into something that looks almost like opportunity. The old city was gone, swept to bare ground, and for a few extraordinary weeks in that autumn of 1666, the ground was, in a sense, a blank sheet. And the cleverest men in England looked at that blank sheet and dreamed. Within days of the fire going out, while the ruins were still too hot to walk on, plans began to arrive on the King's desk for a new London, a rational London, a modern London to be built from nothing on the ashes of the medieval maze. The first and most famous of these plans came from a young man named Christopher Wren, who was not yet the great architect he would become, but who was already a professor of astronomy, a brilliant mathematician, an inventor, one of the most gifted minds of the age, and who had already been engaged, before the fire, in the survey of Old St. Paul's. Wren, with astonishing speed, drew up a plan for an entirely new city, a beautiful, orderly, rational city of broad straight avenues radiating out from great open piazzas, with wide quays along the river and the churches and public buildings set as noble focal points at the meeting of the streets. A city in the grand classical manner, everything spacious and geometric and magnificent, the tangled medieval lanes swept away forever and replaced with light and air and order. John Evelyn, the diarist, drew up a plan of his own, different in its details but similar in its spirit, another vision of a spacious, rational, classical London. And Robert Hooke, another of the great scientific minds of the day, produced yet another. For a brief shining moment it seemed as though London might be entirely reborn, might rise from its ashes not as a repaired version of its cramped old self, but as one of the wonders of the world, a city built to a single grand design. And it did not happen. And the reasons it did not happen are a lesson in their own right, gentle and human and a little rueful, because the great plans, for all their beauty, ran headlong into a wall that no vision could pass. And that wall was ownership. The ground that the planners wished to sweep into broad avenues and open piazzas was not empty ground. It belonged to people, thousands upon thousands of people, each of whom owned a particular narrow plot where their particular house had stood, and each of whom, having lost everything, wanted one thing above all, which was to get back onto their own land and rebuild their own house and their own livelihood as fast as humanly possible. To build Wren's radiant city, every one of those thousands of plots would have had to be bought up, or seized and redistributed, and the tangle of who owned what, of leases and freeholds and mortgages and rights, was so immense, and the money to buy it all so entirely beyond the means of the crown or the city, and the desperate need of the people to rebuild so urgent and so pressing, that the grand plans one by one quietly died and were laid aside, and London was rebuilt in the end upon its own old footprint, street for street, plot for plot, very nearly where it had always been. And yet, and this is the crucial thing, though London was rebuilt on its old plan, it was not rebuilt as the same city. Because the men who governed the rebuilding, though they could not seize the land, could and did lay down the law about what might be built upon it, and it is here, in the unglamorous machinery of building regulations, that the real and lasting good came out of the fire. In the years after the fire, Parliament and the city passed a series of rebuilding acts, and these acts changed London forever, and they did it with a handful of plain, sensible iron rules. No more timber. The new houses were to be built of brick and of stone, and not of wood, so that the city could never again go up like a bonfire. The number of stories and the thickness of the walls were fixed by law according to the type of street, so that the buildings were sound and regular. The old overhanging jetties, those leaning upper floors that had let the fire step across the lanes at rooftop height, were forbidden outright. The new houses were to have flat fronts rising straight up, standing back from one another, so that flame could not so easily leap the gap. The streets themselves, though they mostly followed their old lines, were widened where they could be. The worst of the narrow choking alleys straightened and opened, a few new streets cut through, the steep approaches to the river eased, and the practice of building right down to the water's edge was reformed, so that a proper open quay could run along the Thames, to settle the fantastic tangle of disputes over who owned what and who owed whom. Over ruined leases and burned contracts and half-built party walls, a special court was set up, the Fire Court, staffed by senior judges who gave their time freely, and which sat for years, hearing case after case, cutting through the knots with rough fairness so that the rebuilding would not drown in lawsuits, and it worked, and the city rose. It rose slowly, over years and decades, plot by plot and street by street, and it rose in brick, warm red London brick, a whole new city of it, lower and cleaner and safer and more regular than the dark-leaning wooden warren it replaced. And though it was not the radiant geometric dream of Christopher Wren, it was a far better and a far safer place to live than the medieval city the fire had. Taken, and it was, unmistakably, a new London, the brick and stone city whose bones the modern city still stands upon to this day. And if the grand plan for the streets was laid aside, the grand vision found another home, because Christopher Wren, denied his radiant city of avenues, was given instead the churches and the cathedral, and out of that consolation prize he built the thing that would make his name immortal and give the new London its face. 87 parish churches had burned in the fire. It was decided, in the rebuilding, not to replace all of them, for the parishes were reorganised and some combined, but 51 of them were to be rebuilt, and the man given the task of rebuilding them was Wren, who threw himself into it across the rest of his long life with a fertility of invention that still astonishes anyone who walks the city and looks up. He designed 51 churches, each one different, each one solving the peculiar problem of its own cramped and awkward medieval plot, and it was in the steeples above all that his genius played, because the bodies of the churches were often boxed in and hidden by the houses that pressed around them, but the steeples rose free above the rooftops into the London sky, and Wren made of them a whole orchestra of invention, spires and towers and lanterns and domes, no two alike, some like tiered wedding cakes, some like sharp lead needles, some like little classical temples stacked into the air, and together, rising all across the rebuilt city, they gave the new London a skyline of extraordinary variety and grace. A forest of white steeples standing up out of the red brick, and many of them stand there yet, 3.5 centuries on, tucked between the glass towers of the modern city, the surviving signature of one man's response to one fire. But the steeples were the overture. The great work, the work of a lifetime, was the cathedral. Old St. Paul's was beyond saving. The melted, cracked, fallen ruin on the hill had to come down entirely, and it was Wren who pulled down what the fire had left, and it was Wren who was charged with designing what would rise in its place, and he gave to it the labour of 35 years and very nearly all his art. It did not go smoothly. His first designs were rejected as too radical, too foreign, too little like a proper English cathedral. A model he built of one of them, the famous Great Model, beautiful and daring, was turned down by the clergy, and it is said the rejection reduced the ordinarily composed reign to tears. He compromised, and schemed and secured from the king a warrant that gave him just enough freedom to change the design as the building rose, and change it he did, quietly, year by year, steering the great structure back toward the thing he had wanted all along, so that the cathedral that finally stood was far nobler than the one the committees had approved. And what stood, at the end on the highest ground in the city, where the medieval cathedral had burned, was the new St. Paul's, crowned with its vast dome, one of the largest and most beautiful domes in the world. A dome that Wren engineered with mathematical cunning as 3 shells nested one inside another so that it might soar high enough to command the skyline outside while still seeming, right from within, and it rose over London as the old spire never had, a great pale rounded majesty floating above the brick, visible from every hill and every reach of the river, the new heart and symbol of the rebuilt city. Wren lived to see it finished, which is a mercy granted to very few builders of cathedrals. He was an old man, past 70, when the last stone was set, and it was his own son who laid it, and Wren lived on into his 90s, and in his last years, it is said, he would have himself carried up to the cathedral once a year, and would sit for a while in quiet beneath the great dome he had raised. And when at last he died, full of years and honour, he was buried in the crypt of his own St. Paul's, and over his tomb they set a plain slab and a short inscription in Latin, and part of that inscription has become one of the most famous epitaphs ever written, because it says to anyone who comes looking for a monument to the man, Lector, si monumentum requiris, circumspice, reader, if you seek his monument, look around you. Look around you. The whole cathedral, the whole skyline of white steeples, the whole rebuilt city is the monument. There is no need for a statue. Just look around. It is difficult to think of a more perfect thing to have carved above the grave of the man who rebuilt London out of its ashes, and it is difficult, standing under that dome even now, not to feel the strange long circle of it close. That a fire which began in a baker's oven on a windy night should have ended, through 35 years of one man's patient genius, in this. There was one more thing the rebuilders raised, and it was raised for no practical purpose at all, but only to remember, and it is the thing that carries the name to this day, plainly and simply, the monument. Not far from Pudding Lane, close to the northern end of London Bridge, near the very spot where the fire began, the city resolved to build a great column to stand forever as a memorial to the destruction and the deliverance, and the task of designing it fell, as so much did, to Christopher Wren, working together with his brilliant friend Robert Hooke. That same Hooke who had drawn his own plan for the new city, and who was one of the finest experimental scientists of the age. What the two of them built is a tall fluted column of Portland stone, rising more than 200 feet into the sky, topped with a great gilded flaming urn of bronze, and for a long time it was the tallest isolated stone column in the world. And it still stands there today, dark now with the centuries, wedged in among the offices and the traffic, with a narrow spiral staircase winding up inside it, 311 steps, to a viewing platform near the top from which in the crowded modern city you can still climb up and look out over the rooftops as the people once looked out over the flames. But the loveliest thing about the monument is a secret hidden in its very dimensions, and it is a secret that tells you exactly who built it, because Wren and Hooke were not only architects but scientists, men hungry to measure and to test the workings of the world, and they designed the great hollow column to do a second job entirely. The height of the monument was made to be exactly the distance, measured along the ground, from the column to the spot in Pudding Lane where the fire had begun, a little poem written in stone, the memorial standing as many feet tall as it stands feet away from the thing it remembers, and the shaft was built hollow and true and perfectly vertical, with a spiral stair wound around a central void, and a hinged lid set in the flaming urn at the top, and a laboratory chamber in the base below, precisely so that the whole 200-foot column could be used as a fixed astronomical telescope, a zenith telescope, for observing the stars directly overhead, and as a gigantic instrument for experiments upon gravity and air pressure, and the swinging of a pendulum down its great central well. In practice the column proved too unsteady for the finest measurements, trembling faintly in the wind and under the rumble of the traffic on the bridge, and the scientific dream of it was quietly abandoned. But the intention is written into every stone, and it remains one of the most charming facts of the whole story that the memorial to London's fire is also a secret telescope, built by two curious men who could not raise even a monument to grief without also trying to weigh the air and measure the heavens through it. Around the base of the monument they carved inscriptions, and here the long shadow of the fire's fear reached out one last time, because in the bitter anti-Catholic politics of the years that followed, an additional line was cut into the stone declaring that the fire had been begun by the treachery and malice of the Popish faction, blaming the Catholics for the accident in plain carved letters for all to read, a lie set in stone above the ashes. The poet Alexander Pope, a Catholic himself, would write bitterly of it a little later, of the column that, as he put it, lifts its head and lies, pointing to the sky and telling a falsehood to everyone who passed, and that carved lie stayed on the monument, cut and recut, for the better part of 2 centuries, through all the long years of religious suspicion, until at last, in a calmer and more tolerant age, in the 1830s, the false accusation against the Catholics was finally chiselled away and erased, leaving the monument to say what was always true, that the fire had been a terrible accident and a great deliverance and nothing more, and that no faction and no faith had lit it. The column stands there still tonight, in the sleeping city, dark and tall and quiet among the lit windows of the offices, the gilded flame at its top catching the glow of the streetlights. 311 steps spiralling up through the dark inside it, as many feet tall as it stands feet from the vanished baker's shop. A secret telescope pointed at a sky it was never quite steady enough to see, keeping its long patient watch over the exact place where, on a warm and windy night more than 3.5 centuries ago, the whole enormous story began with a single ember that would not die. And around it, on every side, in every direction the eye can travel, spreads the answer to the question the fire asked. Because the city did not die. It burned, and it grieved, and it buried its dead and hanged its innocent scapegoat, and camped in the fields and wept in the smoking ruins, and then, plot by plot and brick by brick and steeple by steeple and year by patient year, it rose, and it became larger and richer and safer and greater than it had ever been before, until the fire that had seemed the very end of London became, in the long telling, merely the hinge upon which the old city turned into the new. There is a story people like to tell about the Great Fire, a neat and satisfying story, and it is that the fire, for all its horror, did London one enormous secret favour, because it burned away the plague. Remember that the year before the fire had been the year of the Great Plague, the last and worst outbreak of the pestilence that had haunted England for 300 years, and the plague had lived, people came to understand much later, in the black rats that swarmed through the old wooden city, and in the fleas those rats carried. And so the pleasing story goes, that the fire, by burning the rat-infested medieval slums to the ground and driving out or killing the rats, cleansed London of the plague forever. And it is true, and it is a striking fact, that after 1666 the Great Plague never returned to London, that the terrible visitations which had come again and again for centuries simply stopped, and the fire is often given the credit. The truth, as truth usually is more tangled and less tidy than the story. The fire did not burn the whole of London, it destroyed the old walled city, but the crowded suburbs beyond the walls, where a great many of the poor lived, and where the plague had also raged, were largely untouched by the flames, and the plague did not return to those unburned districts either, which it should have done if the fire were the whole explanation. Historians now think the ending of the plague in England had more to do with other things, with changes in the rats themselves, with quarantine and the cordoning off of infected ships and ports, with slow shifts in the disease and its carriers across the whole of Europe, than with the fire alone. And yet the fire surely did not hurt, because the new city that rose after it was built of brick and stone instead of wood and thatch, with wider streets and better drains and fewer of the dark verminous timber warrens where the rats had thronged. And a cleaner, more open, better-built city is a less friendly home for plague, and so the fire, if it did not banish the pestilence single-handed, at least helped to build the kind of city in which the pestilence found it harder to live. What the fire did do, beyond any argument, was to change forever the way that London, and eventually the whole world, thought about disaster and protection, because out of the ashes of 1666 came 2 entirely new things that we now take so much for granted that we forget they had to be invented. And both of them were invented in a real sense because of this fire. The first was fire insurance. Before the Great Fire, if your house burned down, you were simply ruined, and that was the end of it. The loss fell wholly on you, and no one shared it. But the sheer scale of the fire, the sight of tens of thousands of solid, respectable, prudent people reduced to beggary in the fields in a single week through no fault of their own, set clever minds to thinking about how such a risk might be spread, and in the years after the fire, the first true fire insurance companies in the world were founded in London. Offices where a householder could pay a small regular sum in exchange for a promise that, if fire took his house, the company would pay to rebuild it. The loss of the one shared out among the many. And it was a quiet revolution in how human beings guard themselves against catastrophe. And it began here, in the rebuilding of this burned city. And the early insurance companies, having promised to pay for burned houses, very quickly discovered that they had a powerful interest in houses not burning, and so they did a second new thing. They founded their own fire brigades. Each company gave its insured houses a little metal plaque to fix to the wall, a fire mark, bearing the company's badge, and each company hired and equipped teams of firemen with engines and uniforms, and when a fire broke out, these company brigades would race to it and look for their own fire mark upon the burning building and set to work to save the houses their company had insured. It was a strange and imperfect beginning. Brigades that in the early days would sometimes stand by a burning house that carried a rival company's mark, but it was a beginning, the first organised, equipped, professional firefighting the city had ever had, born directly of the lesson that Pudding Lane had taught, that a great city could not go on trusting its survival to leather buckets and the goodwill of neighbours, and from those company brigades over the long generations that followed, would grow at last the idea of a single public fire service belonging to the whole city, the ancestor of every fire engine that races through London to this day. So the fire, which had begun in the failure of the old ways, in a Lord Mayor who would not pull down houses and a city with nothing to fight flame but buckets and hooks, ended by giving birth to the very institutions, insurance and the fire brigade, that would make such a catastrophe far less likely ever to happen again. And that is perhaps the deepest way in which the burning of London was not only an ending, but a beginning, because the pain of it taught the city, and then the world. A set of lessons about sharing risk and organising rescue that we are all, 3.5 centuries later, still quietly living inside every time we insure a home or hear a siren in the night. It is easy, telling the story from this distance, to slide too quickly from the fire to the fine new city, to pass in a single sentence from the smoking ruins to the white steeples and the great dome, as though the rebuilding were a swift and happy thing, and it was not. The rebuilding of London took not months, but decades, the better part of a lifetime, and for the ordinary people who had lost their homes those decades were long and hard and often bitter, and it is worth sitting for a while with that, gently, because it is the truest part of the aftermath. When the fire went out, the great mass of Londoners did not simply move back into fine brick houses. They came back to a plot of blackened ground where their home had been, often deep in debt, their tools and stock and savings gone, their trade interrupted, and they had to find somewhere to live while they rebuilt, and the money to rebuild with, and craftsmen to do the work. And all of this in a city where suddenly every single person needed the same thing at the same time, where bricklayers and carpenters and masons could name their price, where the cost of building materials soared, where whole families crowded for years into rented rooms in the unburned suburbs or into hastily patched sheds among the ruins, waiting for their turn, saving what they could, watching their neighbours' houses rise while their own plot stayed bare, because they had not yet found the means to begin. Some never rebuilt at all. Some sold their scorched plots for what little they could get, and left London altogether, drifting away to other towns, to the country. Their place in the city's life simply ended by the fire. The population of the old walled city, when at last it was rebuilt, was smaller than before, because much of the trade and many of the people had moved, in those years of waiting, out to the west, to the newer, more spacious districts growing up around Westminster and the Strand and the fields beyond. So that the fire quietly shifted the centre of gravity of London itself, hastening the long drift of wealth and fashion westward that would one day give the city its West End, and leaving the rebuilt old city to become, more and more, a place of business and money and offices rather than of homes, which in large part is what it remains to this very day. And there were things the fire took that no rebuilding could ever bring back. Things that had no price and no insurance and no brick and stone replacement. And these are the quietest losses of all. When 87 churches burned, there burned with them the accumulated treasure of 5 centuries of worship, the medieval carving and the painted glass, and the ancient tombs and brasses and the monuments of the long dead, the memorials of generations of Londoners. All of it gone in a night, so that the family graves and the carved faces and the painted saints that had watched over the city since the Middle Ages simply ceased to exist. When the Guildhall burned and the halls of the livery companies burned and the merchants' houses burned, there burned with them records, the paper memory of the city. Deeds and charters and account books and registers going back hundreds of years, the written trail of countless ordinary lives, births and marriages and deaths and debts and bequests, turned to ash, so that for the historian and the family tracing its own past there is in London a kind of wall of fire across the year 1666. A place where the records so often simply stop, burned away, and beyond which it becomes very much harder to see. And the old medieval city itself, the thing that had grown organically over 600 years, the tangle of lanes with their ancient names, the leaning timber houses each shaped by generations of patching and adding, the whole irreplaceable accumulated texture of a place that had been a very long time in the making, all of that was gone at a stroke and could never be remade, because you cannot rebuild 600 years of gradual growth in a hurry. You can only put up something new, however fine, in its place. The Londoners who had grown up in the old city, who had known its lanes since childhood, walked for the rest of their lives through a city that was strange to them, better built perhaps, safer and cleaner and grander, but no longer the place they remembered, the place their own memories were hung upon, and there is a particular quiet grief in that, in surviving a disaster and rebuilding after it, and finding that the world you have rebuilt, though good, is not the world you lost, that home has become a place you can only visit now inside your own head. John Evelyn felt something of this, walking through the changed city in his later years, and so, in his way, did Samuel Pepys, and so did every Londoner old enough to remember what had stood where the new brick now stood. The fire had given the city a future, a great one, but it had taken its past, and the two things were bound together and could not be separated. And that is perhaps the last and deepest truth of the Great Fire of London, that the price of the splendid new city was the whole of the old one, and that every gift the fire gave was also, at the very same time, a thing it took away. We know all of this. We can stand this close to a fire that burned 3.5 centuries ago, and feel its heat, and hear the pigeons, and watch the lead run down the streets, only because a handful of people wrote it down, and it is worth, before we let the story go, spending a little while with them, the watchers, the ones whose careful private words became our eyes. 2 of them stand above all the rest, and they were friends, and they were both, by great good fortune, in London through the whole of that terrible week, and they were both in the habit of writing down what they saw. Samuel Pepys we have already met, the anxious, curious, wonderfully human naval official who buried his Parmesan cheese, and Pepys went on, after the fire, to a long and distinguished career, rising to become one of the ablest administrators the English Navy ever had. The man who did more than almost anyone to turn the Navy into a professional and permanent force. But his eyesight, which had troubled him for years, grew worse, and at last, only a few years after the fire, in 1669, he laid down his diary for good, believing, wrongly as it happened, that he was going blind and could no longer keep it, and he closed the great private record with a few sad words about the darkness he thought was coming, and never took it up again. And so the most vivid voice of the age falls silent just a few years after the fire, and the diary that tells us so much was locked away and forgotten, and not read by anyone for well over a century, until long after Pepys was dust, when it was at last deciphered from its shorthand and given to the world, and the frightened man in the burning city stepped, unknowing, into a kind of immortality he never sought. His friend John Evelyn, the other great witness, was a gentler, graver, more scholarly soul, a man of gardens and books and quiet good works, and Evelyn kept his diary for the whole of his very long life, and it is to him that we owe some of the most solemn and beautiful descriptions of the fire, the melting cathedral, the streets running with molten lead, the stones flying like grenades, the miserable families in the fields. Evelyn had, only a little before the fire, written a pamphlet complaining of the smoke and squalor and disorder of the old London, and dreaming of a cleaner, finer city, and after the fire he drew up one of the grand rejected plans for rebuilding it, and though his plan, like Wren's, came to nothing, he lived on for nearly 40 more years and saw a great deal of the new city rise, and he died an old man at the very start of the 1700s, one of the last living people who could remember, in his own eyes, the whole of the medieval London that the fire had erased. And what of the others, the smaller players, the ones the fire caught up for a moment and then let go? Sir Thomas Bloodworth, the Lord Mayor who would not pull down the houses, who said a woman might piss the fire out and went back to bed, lived on too, but his name was ruined, and he knew it, and he spent the rest of his days under the quiet permanent shadow of that one night's failure, remembered by everyone, then and ever after, as the man who might have stopped the Great Fire of London and did not, which is a heavy thing to carry, and a reminder, if a gentle one, that the great catastrophes of history so often turn not on villains, but on ordinary tired men making an ordinary wrong choice in the middle of the night. And Thomas Fariner, the baker, whose oven it most likely was, rebuilt. He always swore his oven had been out, and perhaps in his own heart he came to believe it entirely, and no one ever proved otherwise, and he was not punished, and he went back to Pudding Lane, to the very ground where it had all begun, and he built a new house and a new bakehouse there in the new brick, and he went on baking, and when he died, a few years later, he was buried, as it happens, in a nearby church that had itself been rebuilt after the fire, and his children carried on the family trade. There is something quietly astonishing in that, in the baker simply going home, to the exact spot where the fire that consumed a city had started under his own roof, and setting up his ovens again, and getting on with the making of bread, as though to insist, by the plain fact of his return, that life is stubborn, that people rebuild not only cities but their own small ruined corners of them, that even the man at the very centre of the greatest disaster of the age gets up in the morning and lights his fire and goes back to work. And so the players of that week went their separate ways into the ordinary future, the diarists to their long lives and their locked-away words, the failed mayor to his disgrace, the baker back to his ovens, the king to his throne and his pleasures, and in time to his own quiet death. And the fire that had thrown them all together for 4 extraordinary days released them one by one back into their lives, and receded, slowly, from a lived and terrifying thing into a remembered one, and then into a told one, and then at last into the calm old story that it is tonight. Let us go back once more into the middle of the 4 days, not for the facts of them, which we have, but for the feeling of them, for the sheer physical enormity of what it was to be alive in England in that first week of September while London burned. Because the accounts that survive strain, again and again, to describe a thing that was almost beyond describing, and in their straining they let us feel it. The fire, at its height, was not a fire in the sense that anyone had ever known a fire. It was a roaring, living, breathing thing the size of a city, drawing the air into itself from miles around, so that the wind at its edges blew inward toward the flames, feeding them, and the sound of it, the eyewitnesses said, was a continuous deep roar. The crackle and crash of 10,000 houses burning and falling merged into one vast unbroken noise that could be heard far out into the country, under which ran the sharper sounds, the crack of exploding stone, the boom of the gunpowder charges, the crash of collapsing roofs, and terribly, on the first days, the cries of the people. The heat was so great that men could not come within a great distance of the flames, that the very cobbles glowed, that the iron chains and locks and bars of the burned buildings were found afterward melted and run together, that the great bells of the churches, the ancient bells that had rung over London for centuries, melted in their towers and ran down in streams of bronze, and pooled, and set again into shapeless lumps among the ashes, so that the voices of the old city fell silent, not by being stilled, but by being unmade, poured out of their own shape by a heat no London fire had ever reached. The smoke rose in a single vast column and then spread into a pall that covered the whole sky, and it turned day into a strange brown twilight, and it blotted out the sun, so that at the height of the fire the city lay under a false and dreadful darkness at noon, lit red from below by its own burning, and John Evelyn wrote that the light of the flames was seen above 40 miles round about for many nights, that the glow of London on fire lit the underside of the clouds across half of southern England, so that people in distant villages came out into their fields at night and saw the sky glowing in the direction of the capital, and knew, without being told, that something enormous and terrible was happening there. And the ash fell. The updraught of the fire carried burning fragments and charred paper and flakes of ash high into the air and scattered them for astonishing distances downwind. And it is one of the small, unforgettable facts of the fire that scorched scraps of paper, half-burned pages from the books and records of London, drifted down out of the sky as far away as Windsor, and even, it was recorded, as far as Oxford, more than 50 miles off, where people picked up off the ground bits of singed paper carried to them on the wind from the burning of a city they could not. See, fragments of ledgers and letters and holy books, the confetti of a catastrophe, come to rest quietly in fields half a county away. Imagine standing in a meadow in Oxfordshire in the first week of September, in the strange coppery light of those days, with the sky faintly hazed even at that distance, and having a flake of charred paper settle onto your sleeve and picking it up, and seeing on it a few burned words in a stranger's hand, and understanding that somewhere far to the east the greatest city in the land was coming apart in the sky. That is the scale of the thing, and it is the sort of detail that the mind can actually hold, better than acres and pounds and thousands of houses, the single flake of burned paper on the sleeve of someone 50 miles away. And in the city itself, at the very heart of it, the experience was beyond even that, a world reduced to heat and noise and smoke and the frantic labour of saving what could be saved. Days without sleep, faces blackened past recognition, throats raw, eyes streaming, the wealthy and the poor levelled into the same soot-covered exhaustion, and over all of it the constant terrible sense, which the accounts return to again and again, that the fire could not be stopped, that it would simply go on until it had taken everything, that this perhaps was the end of London altogether, not a disaster within the life of the city, but the death of the city itself. That belief, that dread, is the thing hardest to recover now, sitting safely in the long afterward, knowing as we do that London survived and grew and is out there tonight, larger and brighter than ever, its river of lights running to the sea. But the people in the fields at Moorfields did not know that. For them, on those nights, watching the whole eastern sky burn, it truly seemed that the world they knew was ending, and that nothing would ever stand on that ground again. And it is only because they were wrong, because the city did rise, that we can tell the story now as a calm and even a comforting one, a story with a morning at the end of it. London is very far from the only great city that has burned. It is one of the oldest patterns in the whole long story of human settlement, that we gather ourselves together in our thousands and our hundreds of thousands into these dense wooden and later brick and stone hives, and that fire, sooner or later, comes for them. Rome burned, famously, in the reign of Nero, 16 centuries before London did, a fire that raged for days through the crowded timber tenements of the ancient city and left much of it in ashes. And Rome, like London, rebuilt, in brick and marble, grander than before. Cities across the medieval and early modern world burned again and again, Moscow and Constantinople and 100 lesser towns, wood and thatch and narrow lanes, and a stray spark, doing always the same terrible work. And after London, other great cities would burn in their turn, and one of the most famous, 2 centuries later and an ocean away, was Chicago. which in the year 1871 was swept by a fire so like London's in its causes and its course. A dry season, a wooden city, a wind, a single small beginning that ran out of control, that the two disasters are often told almost in the same breath, and Chicago too, like London, like Rome, buried its dead and cleared its ruins and rebuilt itself larger and finer and safer than before, this time in steel and stone, and rose to become one of the great cities of the modern world. There is a rhythm to it, across all the centuries and all the continents, the city that burns and the city that rises, and the great fire of London stands near the centre of that long human story, one of its most complete and best remembered chapters. The tinder city and the spark and the wind and the 4 days of ruin and the decades of rebuilding and the finer city at the end, the whole arc laid out clean and plain and well recorded, a kind of parable of how human beings meet catastrophe and refuse, in the end, to be defeated by it. And London, having burned once so terribly and risen so completely, seems to have taken something from the experience deep into its own sense of itself, a stubbornness, a refusal to be finished, that would be called upon again, most terribly, in a later age. Because London would burn once more, nearly 3 centuries after the Great Fire, when in the autumn and winter of 1940 and 1941 the bombs of the Blitz rained down upon the city night after night and set it ablaze from end to end, and once again the fires raged around St. Paul's, and once again the great dome that Christopher Wren had raised out of the ashes of the first fire stood wreathed in smoke and flame. And there is a famous photograph from those nights, one of the most famous images in the whole history of the country, of Wren's dome standing serene and unbroken above a sea of smoke and burning rooftops, surviving, holding, refusing to fall, and it became, in that darkest hour, a symbol of the whole city's refusal to be broken, the same dome, on the same hill, above the same city, keeping its watch through a second great burning as it had risen from the first. It is a long thread to follow, from the ember in the baker's oven in 1666 to the cathedral standing in the smoke of the Blitz in 1940, but it is a real one, because the cathedral in the photograph is the cathedral the first fire built, and the courage in the photograph is in part the courage a city learns by surviving such things. And the whole of it, the first fire and the rebuilding and the second fire and the survival, is one continuous story of the same place refusing, again and again, across the centuries to be destroyed, of a city that has burned to the ground more than once, and has each time risen from its own ashes. So that the Great Fire of London is not, in the end, a story about destruction at all, but a story about endurance, about the strange, deep resilience of the places human beings make and love, and the way that even the worst that can happen to them so often turns, given time enough, into merely another layer in a story that goes on and on and on. Every fire, however great, has an edge, a line on the ground where it stopped, where the last house to burn stands blackened beside the first house to be spared. And the edges of the Great Fire of London are worth walking, gently in the mind, because a fire's boundary is a strange and arbitrary and very human thing, decided by a gap blown in time, or a change in the wind, or a lucky patch of open ground, or a wall that happened to hold, and the line it leaves behind can still be traced here and there in the city today. To the west, the fire drove hard along the river and up through the heart of the old city, and it was checked at last near the western edge of the walls and just beyond them, saved from spreading further into the wealthy districts along the Strand and toward Whitehall by the fire breaks and the falling wind. And one of the places where its westward march finally halted was a spot that came to be, called Pie Corner, near Smithfield, and there, to mark the boundary and, in the moralizing spirit of the age, to draw a lesson from it, someone later set up a small gilded statue high on the corner of a building, a plump little gilded figure of a boy, the Golden Boy of Pie Corner, with an inscription beneath it declaring that the fire had been stopped there, and adding, in the peculiar logic of the time, that the fire had been sent as a punishment for the sin of gluttony, because it had begun in Pudding Lane and ended at Pie Corner. both of them named as it happened for food, and so the pious concluded that the whole catastrophe must somehow have been a judgment upon the greed and gluttony of the city. And they gilded a fat little boy to say so, and the golden boy is there still, high on his corner, a small strange survivor, pointing his silent moral at the hurrying crowds below who almost never look up and see him. To the east, as we have heard, the fire was stopped at the tower, where the garrison blew up the houses around the fortress and saved it and its terrible store of gunpowder, and so the great medieval castle survived, and survives yet, at the eastern edge of the burnt ground. To the south there was the river, the broad Thames, which the fire could not cross, and so Southwark on the far bank was spared, though London Bridge itself, the ancient bridge crowded along its whole length with houses, was in dreadful danger, and part of it did burn, but a gap in the buildings on the bridge, left by an earlier fire years before, chanced to act as a fire break, and stopped the flames from running across the bridge and setting the far bank alight, so that the accident of an old fire saved the city from the new one reaching over the water. And here and there along the northern and western edges, other things were saved by luck and effort together. The Temple, the ancient home of the lawyers with its round Norman church, was reached by the fire and partly burned, but the church itself, and much of the temple survived. Some of the old halls and houses at the very margins came through, and a scatter of buildings deep within the burnt zone, a very few, survived by miracle in the midst of the general ruin. A stone church here, a Guildhall shell there, standing scorched but whole among acres of ash. If you could have risen above the city on the morning after, as the smoke thinned, you would have seen the shape of it laid out plain, a great irregular scar of blackened ground filling the whole heart of the old walled city and spilling a little beyond the walls, and around its edges the abrupt line where the burning stopped and the living city began again. And you would have understood, looking at that map of ruin, how very nearly the whole of London had gone, how the fire had eaten 4/5 of everything within the walls and had been stopped, at the end, not by any grand design, but by a river it could not cross, a bridge with a lucky gap, a fortress full of desperate men with barrels of powder, a wind that finally died, and the exhausted labour of thousands of ordinary people pulling and blowing down their own homes to make the gaps that starved it. The line it left is faint now, 3.5 centuries on, buried under the endless rebuildings of the centuries between, but it is there, if you know how to look, in the little gilded boy on his corner, in the name of a lane, in the sudden age of a surviving wall. The ghost of the edge of the fire, still faintly drawn across the map of the living city. And that is perhaps the gentlest way to come, at last, toward the end of this long story, by thinking of what is still there tonight, in the real and living city, 350 years and more after the flames. Because the Great Fire of London is not only a tale in a book, it is written into the actual streets, quietly, for anyone who walks them slowly enough to notice. The monument is there, of course, the great column with its gilded flame, standing near the foot of the bridge, as many feet tall as it stands feet from the place the fire began, its 311 steps spiralling up through the dark inside, and Pudding Lane is still there, still bearing its name, though there is no baker on it now and nothing to see but the plain walls of modern buildings, and set into one of them, a small plaque to say that here, on this narrow lane, the Great Fire of London began, which the crowds pass every day without a glance. The golden boy is there on his corner at Pie Corner, marking the far edge of the burning, and rising all across the old city are the churches, Wren's 51 churches, or the many of them that still stand, their white steeples and towers tucked now between the glass and steel of the modern towers, each one different, each one a piece of one man's answer to the fire, and if you walk the old streets and keep looking up, you will find them again and again, a needle spire here, a tiered tower there, a little dome, quietly holding their ground among the banks and the offices, and above them all, on the highest ground, rides the great pale dome of St. Paul's, Wren's masterpiece, the cathedral the fire made possible. And if you go inside and down into the crypt, you can find his tomb with its famous words, "Reader." If you seek his monument, look around you, and you can find two kept in that cathedral, worked into its very fabric, the memory of the fire that cleared the ground for it. Fragments of the old burned city surface here and there when the modern city digs its foundations, scorched Roman tile and blackened medieval stone, the deep archaeology of the fire, a layer of ash and burning buried under the streets that the builders still strike. Now and then, when they sink a new tower into the London clay, a thin dark line in the ground, the ashes of 1666, pressed between the centuries above it and the centuries below. And the shape of the city itself, the very plan of the streets in the old square mile, is still, in its bones, the plan that the rebuilding laid down. The old medieval lines mostly kept, but the buildings all of brick and stone from that day to this, the whole character of the place, safe and solid and no longer a thing of leaning timber, descending in an unbroken line from the rebuilding acts that the fire forced into being. So the fire is everywhere, in the living city, and nowhere, all at once, a thing that happened so long ago that no stone of the burning itself remains standing, and yet a thing whose consequences you cannot walk 10 steps in that part of London without touching, the churches and the cathedral and the monument and the brick and the street plan and the buried ash. The whole visible city standing as the long, slow answer to a single ember on a single windy night. It is a strange and a rather beautiful thought to fall asleep on, that a disaster can become, given enough time, simply a place that the worst night in a city's history can turn, over the patient centuries, into the ordinary ground that people walk to work across without a thought, into a lane with a plaque, a gilded boy on a corner, a forest of white steeples, a great grey dome against the sky, that the fire that once seemed the end of everything is now just the reason the city looks the way it looks. The invisible foundation under the visible town, the story sleeping quietly under the pavement while the living city goes on above it, awake and busy and entirely unafraid. There is one more thing worth turning over slowly in the mind, in the quiet before sleep, and it is the strange narrowness of the whole thing, the way the Great Fire of London, like so many of the great events of history, turned upon a handful of tiny hinges, any one of which, moved only a little, would have given us an entirely different story, or no story at all. Consider how much had to go exactly wrong, and in exactly the right order. The summer had to be one of the driest in living memory, drying the timber to tinder, and it was. The wind had to be blowing, and blowing strong, and blowing from the east, the one direction that would drive the fire from the poor riverside quarter straight into the crowded heart of the city. And it was, and it held, without slackening, for the better part of 4 days, which is itself a remarkable and unlucky thing, because an east wind in England does not usually blow so hard for so long. The fire had to begin at night, when everyone was asleep and slow to wake. It had to begin close to the river, close to the warehouses full of pitch and oil and brandy, so that within hours it could reach the fuel that would make it unstoppable. And at the one moment when a firm hand might still have contained it, in the small dark hours of that first morning, the man with the authority to act had to be the wrong man, tired and dismissive, who looked at the flames and said a woman might piss them out and went back to bed, instead of a man who would have said, pull them all down, now, and made the gap while the gap could still have saved the city. Change any one of those things, a wetter summer, a gentler or a different wind, a fire begun at noon instead of midnight, a bolder Lord Mayor, and the Great Fire of London is not the Great Fire at all, but merely another of the 100 small fires that London had every year and forgot by the following week, and Old St. Paul's stands to this day, and Wren builds no dome. And the medieval city with all its leaning timber and its ancient records and its painted churches survives into our own time, and the whole face of London and a good part of its history is different. That is the vertigo of history, the sense you get, looking closely at any of its great turning points, of how very nearly it might all have gone another way, of how the enormous consequences hang from the thinnest of threads, a wind, a night, a tired man's bad decision. And yet, and this is the strange comfort in it, the consequences, once they had happened, wove themselves into something whole and lasting, and, in the long run, even good. Because out of that unlucky conjunction of drought and wind and darkness and dismissal came the brick city and the fire brigades and the insurance offices and Wren's churches and the great dome and all the safety and grandeur of the London that followed, so that the terrible accident became, over time, the foundation of something better than what it destroyed. History does not seem to mind, in the end, how narrowly things turned. It simply takes whatever happened, the accident and the folly and the courage and the loss, and it builds the future on top of it. And the future does not remember the alternatives that never came to be, the wetter summers and the bolder mayors and the unburned cathedrals, but only what actually was, which becomes, in time, the only thing that could ever have been, the settled and unquestioned ground of the world we know. And so the fire, which might so easily never have happened, having happened, becomes permanent, becomes the way things are, becomes London, and the thin thread it hung from is forgotten, and the great dome stands on the hill as though it had always been meant to, as though no other London had ever been possible, as though the whole long story had only ever been going to end exactly here. So let us go back, one last time, all the way back to where we began, to the warm dark of that first night, before any of it had happened, when the city was still whole and still asleep, and the story had not yet started. Picture Pudding Lane again, the short, steep, narrow lane running down toward the river, the timber houses leaning close overhead, the wind moving along it, warm and steady out of the east. Picture the baker's shop, dark and quiet, the ovens raked out and banked down for the night, or so the baker believed, the family asleep in the rooms above, the manservant, the daughter, the frightened young maid who would not, in a few hours' time, be able to make herself climb out onto the roof. Picture the single ember, somewhere in the warm brick belly of the oven or the woodpile stacked a little too close beside it, the one small spark that should have died with all the others and did not, glowing quietly to itself in the dark, patient, unremarkable, no different to look at from 1,000 embers that had died safely on 1,000 other nights. That is where it all begins, in a thing so small that no one saw it, so ordinary that it had no business changing anything at all, and yet from that single stubborn ember, over the 4 days that followed, would come the burning of 13,000 houses and 87 churches and a great cathedral, the flight of 100,000 people into the fields, the melting of the bells and the running of the lead, the falling ash in Oxford, the hanging of an innocent man, and then, over the 50 years that followed, the brick city and the white steeples and the great dome and the monument and the fire brigades and the insurance offices and the whole long future of London. All of it. The disaster and the deliverance together, unspooling from that one tiny glowing point in the dark that no one noticed and no one could have stopped. It is the way of history, that the smallest things and the largest are bound together, that an ember becomes a city, that a spark in a bakehouse becomes a dome on a hill, and that the people caught up in it, the baker and the mayor and the king and the diarist burying his cheese in the garden, are each just trying to get through the night, with no idea at all that they are standing inside one of the great stories, that what they do in these few dark hours will be told and retold for centuries after they are dust. And that is the last quiet thought to carry down into sleep. That the fire is long out now, that it has been out for 3.5 centuries, that every flame of it died away into cold ash and the ash was cleared and built over and forgotten, and that what was left, in the end, was not the burning, but the city, the great living city that rose from it, and stands tonight larger and brighter than anything those frightened people in the fields could ever have imagined, its river of lights running down to the sea, its dome pale against the dark, its streets full of sleeping people who have never once feared that their wooden houses might go up in the night. Because there are no wooden houses any more. because a fire long ago taught the city to build in brick, and the lesson held, and the city is safe, and the story is over, and the ember that started everything has been cold for longer than most countries have existed. History does not really disappear. It only sinks slowly out of memory and into the ground, and becomes the quiet foundation that everything else is built upon. The ashes under the pavement, the reason the streets run as they run, the settled and forgotten floor beneath the feet of the living, who walk across it every day entirely unafraid, and do not know, and do not need to know, what once burned there. And now the story is told, all of it, from the ember in the dark to the dome on the hill, and there is nothing left for you to do tonight but rest. Are you still awake? If you are, there is no need to be, not any longer, because the fire is out, and the city is safe, and the whole long night of it has passed into morning, and then into years, and then into the calm old story you have just been carried through, and it asks nothing more of you now. If you are still awake, there is another gentle journey waiting for you on the screen, another long, slow walk through some far corner of the past, ready to begin whenever you wish it, so that you need never lie in the dark with nowhere for your mind to go. And if these quiet histories help you find your way down into sleep, you might, only if you truly wish to, leave a like and subscribe, so that more of them will find you on the nights when sleep is slow to come. And you might leave, down in the comments, the name of the place where you are listening from, and the hour of your own local time, a small light set down on the map for the other sleepless souls who will come here after you, from every time zone in the turning world, one after another, all of us going quietly to bed together. But that is all for the morning, and the morning is a long way off, and there is nothing now that needs your attention at all. So let the city fade. Let the dome and the steeples and the dark lane and the single ember all grow dim and drift away. Let your breathing go slow and long and easy, in and out, like the tide going gently off a flat and quiet shore. Let the small weight of the day slip the last inch from your shoulders and be gone. You are warm, and you are safe, and there is nothing in the dark to fear, and everything that was ever going to happen in this story has already happened, long, long ago, and turned out well in the end. Close your eyes now, let the last of the light go. Rest, and be easy, and sleep. Good night, and sweet dreams.